I want to talk about lifelong learning for a world worth living in. And I thought a way of starting was really to describe something of the gap between the sort of what that meant for me when I worked. My job in England for a long time in IAS was to get up in the morning and try and say it in a fresh and different way, and adults to government. Otherwise, they wouldn't pay any attention to, they'd think education's about small people. But by and large, within structures that you kind of recognise, alliances that seemed to make some sort of sense. And then I spent most of the last 3 or 4 years helping to negotiate the role of lifelong learning in the future of Sustainable Development Goals. The UN adopted 15, 17 goals for global development for the next 15 years, and the education one includes lifelong learning in it. Of course, the devil's in the detail, and that's probably more theatrical than much of an achievement. But in that work, we come across lifelong learning meaning something really rather different. So I thought overall it's about learning to address social, political and environmental change, and to recognise the challenges that people face. And I'm deliberately not starting with lifelong learning equals getting people the skills they need to enter the labour market, because I think we've had a kind of bewildering capture of the range of things people beyond initial education need and want to do in learning, into a rather narrow form of neoliberal thinking, of utilitarian thinking, in which only those things that can be readily counted count, and which only those things with a very short sprint to the labour market are likely to be funded. So I thought it was just worth starting looking at some different contexts. This is Haiti after the earthquake, Port-au-Prince, and nearly everybody in the picture is dead. And the chap on the left and the other people who were taking the photograph have survived the catastrophe, but along with large numbers of people dying, civil administration collapsed, and following that, really helpful international development bodies came along with a view that you could kind of flatten everything and build again. And of course, accidentally, not only have you lost your job, not only have you lost your family, but also in this process you're likely to lose your land. So in this context, adult educators organise themselves as extraordinary title, the Defenders of the Oppressed, who saw their task as to train people in being barefoot advocates, legal workers, enabling people to assert their rights. Really rather different. I mean, it's not that we don't have tenants groups work, but it's a rather more dramatic context to be doing our work. And this one is from the Philippines. It isn't actually immediately after the last and rather famous tsunami, but an earlier one. And it involved the collapse and disappearance underwater of communities who included people who were, as part of their lives, worship their ancestors and needed to go to the graves and so on. Now they're 20 feet underwater. First, you have to physically move. Secondly, you have to reconstruct yourself culturally to be able to make sense of your life and all those businesses that we deal with in the migration debates. And the discomfort of the people who receive you, the discomfort of people who've had to leave their lives and values behind, and the kind of transitional challenges of people who are comfortable with the moving and helping to make sense of it. But before they can do that, they have to organise learning the skills of digging the mess out and making the place safe. So I thought, again, that's adult education in relation to environmental change, climate change, that's really rather more dramatic than something we've had to deal with. This is from Burkina Faso, where a group of rather traditional herders have concerns that their sons can't go to school, and who because schools are in settled communities and nomadic herders don't stay in the same place. Go to a voluntary organisation called Andar Pintal and ask them, will you organise education for our sons together? And of course, as good adult educators, they say no, not unless you also organise education for your daughters. Initially, that's got to be separate, and then slowly you negotiate it together. Now, that may feel like it's education about children, but of course the front issue around rights there is about educating parents to accept the preconditions for securing effective social change in a community-based setting. And this is a group of, I think, the most inspiring educators I met over the last 5 years. They're literacy workers from Delhi who work in Uttar Pradesh with Dalit communities, untouchable women, who's often never allowed out of the house, and who organise literacy programs and empower women to have their own economic independent lives. And you can imagine this generates a great deal of hostility and fuss. There are really benign laws about women's right to education in India, and they mean nothing if they don't beat on the pulses of village by village. And I think each of those examples throws up issues that, whilst they're rather dramatic, they do have some kind of resonance with issues that happen here. It doesn't matter what we say about the value of lifelong learning. If you can't make it beat upon the pulses of the people, it doesn't really mean very much. This is, I won't stay with it long, but the UN trying to do a summary of what it thought adult learning was likely to be about it during the debates argued that you wanted environmental sustainability, inclusive economic development, peace and human security, and inclusive human development. And actually in each of those areas, to achieve any of them, you do need learning by adults to happen. And so that's a way of saying an initiative towards a learning city in Belfast is a very encouraging development, I think. Not least because you can't organise these things at a national level very easily. The power of silos is bad enough in a city, but it's dramatically worse when you're operating across a whole nation. And well, to go back to what I think the issues are, I think lifelong learning work is about imagining another possible world. None of the situations I described are ideal for the people who are engaged in them, and the learning activity is clearly around social change and imagining a different and better life for people who participate in it. And what does that mean for us? I mean, all of the time, what I'm hoping you're doing is thinking, this is a load of bonkers nonsense that I didn't think I was coming to, but, what does it mean for you? Because I can't come to Northern Ireland and tell you what your reality is, but I can't really talk about any of these either, but if it's from far away, never mind. The World Social Forum, the World Economic Forum brings Bill Gates and his mates and various economic gurus and statesmen to some very posh place in Switzerland where they all sit about and decide our futures. Well, people in Latin America thought this doesn't really speak to our life experience, so 60,000 of them the first year in Porto Alegre in Brazil got together, and every year ever since, to imagine other ways of making a world that we want to live in. So arguments like the Tobin tax on having financial transactions globally taxed in such a way that they don't automatically privilege those people with capital, but see reinvestments on behalf of people who've got very little, develop in that kind of way. They don't make any resolutions, they just meet and debate, and it's an extraordinarily energetic environment when people give themselves permission to think outside the box, as we saw this morning. It's great, and so that's another picture of that. In the mid-90s, Jacques Delors, who is in an odd way one of my heroes, when he was at the EU, his president of the Commission, he published a white paper which said economic development and social inclusion share in common lifelong learning. You can't achieve either of them without it. He then moved on to UNESCO and chaired the body which produced Learning, the Treasure Within, which argued that there are 4 pillars for a learning society. Learning to know and learning to do. And those are things I think we know quite a lot about how to do in our education and training systems. They're focused on learning to know and learning to do. And the third and fourth are learning to be. You might say learning to become, but learning to be is about identity, capital, and a sense of yourself in relation to the world. And learning to live together is recognizing that diversity and inclusiveness are pretty central. And I think they're not a bad benchmark for asking how well does any given piece of social policy affecting adults as learners, how well does that work out? So I thought this is where I move off grand stories about the world and come back to the struggle that really, I think, if you look at the industrial world, has dominated thinking about learning in general, but especially learning for people beyond initial education over the last 30 years. Broadly, the OECD has argued a human capital argument that in order to generate healthy profits in a world in which physical capital was no longer a source of massive profits, you needed to recognize that people's skills were a source of investment and profit making. And UNESCO arguing, well, actually human rights is what matters, that education is a fundamental human right without which people can't exercise their other rights. So the OECD analysis and UNESCO analysis oddly got published, both of them, in 1996. And at first that led to, you may remember, the years of the first iteration of a Labour government spending quite a lot of money in different ways on lifelong learning, because both sides of the fence were arguing for more investment for a period. But then the OECD won. And I suppose I've used this slide a lot over the last 30 years, that the argument is that if you want economic modernisation and you want social inclusion, the donkeys have to work together. They can't pull in opposite directions. Obviously, we live, as the grand narratives will tell you, in times when there's a globalization of goods and services, where you can design something in New York. New York, you can make it in the Philippines. You can ship it with Panamanian. You can do your marketing in Milan, and you can finance it from London and show your profits in the Cayman Islands. And the globalization of services makes it really rather difficult for anyone to feel they've got security. Economic crises, climate change, demographic. Each of these, of course, has a lifelong learning challenge at the heart of it, and that's what the pictures at the beginning I was trying to show. Technological change, changing patterns of work, and of course, with demographic change again, huge impacts on health budgets and so on, and which is why I was really interested in public health as a stimulus for lifelong learning policy here. Issues around community cohesion, particularly with large amounts of migration. If Bangladesh is going to be completely underwater in 40 years, I mean, the numbers of people who live there and migrate elsewhere will absolutely swamp any debates we're having in Europe about the marginal shifts that we're seeing. Contested values and an increasing democratic deficit. It's really rather hard to know where power lies. That old Aaron Bevan thing of you go to the village pump looking for power and event. Anyway, wherever you end up going, when he was foreign secretary, he decided that wherever you went, power wasn't there, and that for sure is true now. But on the other hand, rising life expectancy, if not rising good health, improved living standards for lots of us, potential arising of positive changes from technological innovation, better communications, but also a recognition that growth's not enough and that well-being matters too. And quite interesting, Sarkozy, when he was the president of France, got really rather disturbed that France was very low down in all the international league tables about good life, and he thought, this is obviously bonkers. Everybody knows the quality of life in France is that to which everybody aspires, and it was pointed out to him that GDP doesn't measure what's good in France, so he set up a commission with Joseph Stiglitz and so on to chair it, saying Marcia Sen, to look at what the strengths and limitations of GDP were, and it opens brilliantly by saying, if you drive safely to work, there is no benefit to the economy at all. GDP doesn't recognise that as a useful thing to have done. But if you have a crash, it's fantastic, because the policeman needs to come, adding to his workload. The person who takes away the car to mend it, your car to mend it, the hospital that has to take, of course, the ambulance to take you in, the hospital, the HR worker who has to manage the gap in your... You see the point I'm making. By the time you've finished, your car crash is a terrific stimulus to GDP. So logically, you have a car crash every day on your way to work and GDP thrives. So in other words, GDP doesn't always measure everything that we might think valuable. And that too is the key point in the spirit level, Wilkinson and Pickett's book, which basically argues that countries in all kinds of areas of social policy outcomes, that countries with narrower gaps of inequality between the affluent and the least affluent do better in absolutely all the respects of social policy that you might want. And incidentally, there are countries that invest in seriously useless adult learning too. So one benchmark I have for a society worth living in is that they waste money on the kind of learning you can't see an immediate and short-term use value out of. And since that's what I spent my whole working life arguing, I really like this argument. However, when you look at the UK and you look at the productivity figures, you see what a mess we're in the UK. So the Office of National Statistics, really interesting. Output in the UK 18 percentage points below G7. This is last month for 2014. And this is the widest productivity we've had since they began measuring these figures comparatively 25 years ago. Output per worker, as opposed to per hour worked, is 19% below. The reason it's lower is because we work longer, not necessarily harder, but longer than other people do. So we have a huge productivity gap, and that's going to worry politicians of all sorts. You have to say that this is a really concerning picture. Since the economic crisis of 2008, most other countries in the EU 28 have decided to spend more money on training and developing people in the workplace. But the UK, it's collapsed. We had 20%, we've now got 15.8%. And really, the only other countries that are absolutely like that are Portugal and Greece, which have both had the most extraordinary, there is quite a gap between these figures and how we hear the debate offered about our economic performance. There's often been figures to show quite high levels of participation in general in the UK in lifelong learning, but if you look at the little chart over on the left, that's hours per worker spent in training. These are slightly out-of-date figures, but the broad picture remains true, that the EU average is significantly more. We spend 100 hours per worker who does get training. The EU average is 400, and in Denmark it's 900. The point is, if you took out induction training when people were starting jobs and health and safety training, our figures are almost entirely non-existent, that we don't train. I mean, in England, it's clear that the train to gain policy through the 2000s taught employers that the state will pay for education and training. Meanwhile, if you look at adult participation by social class, this is figures from what was called NIOS last year, you'll see roughly the higher up, the ABs of professional managerial, the social class divisions are established early and they last. At half of people in the lowest social categories say they've done no learning since school. This doesn't mean they haven't done any. It means they don't see it for themselves. When asked, they say, no, I haven't. And then you have to ask yourself, well, if Sarkozy's right and there's more to it than economic prosperity, how is it that what we seem to have done is to create a picture in which the more you have had, the more you'll get again, whether that's in the workplace, where managers and senior staff get much more training than junior staff, whether it's voluntarily engaged with in informal provision, or even in the level of networking that people do independently by themselves. Raymond Williams argued in a wonderful piece in 1961 that at times of change, adults turn to learning to understand what's happening, to make adjustments in the light of it, and to shape change. And to go back to the participation figures, if you've got such a differential participation, who gets to shape change is quite a significant issue. Now you can say you find those experiences not only in formal education, but that's partly why I started with the pictures at the front. I'm not talking about the education industry so much as how far you're likely to have internalized your sense of yourself as an agent of change in this. I think effective lifelong learning involves noticing who isn't there and what can be done about it. This morning at the launch of the Learning Festival, a really inspiring description of men's sheds, a great movement emerged out of Australia, touches blokes who've never been touched by any kind of structured opportunity for engagement at all, really. And at lunchtime, a colleague who used to work with the Chinese Welfare Association asked, well, how much diversity is there in participation? It's a key question to notice, I think the core question for an effective lifelong learning policy, to ask who isn't there and what can be done about it. It's work actually that derived from Naomi Sargent's work in the OU, at the beginning of the OU, to capture the kind of statistics that enable us to analyse who is there and who isn't. So working class people, ethnic, I mean, they are the list for any social policy arena you might expect to look at. So then you think, well, what do you do about it? And I spent my life kind of trying to get little shifts in the law. I negotiated a £210 million pot for protecting seriously useless learning in England. Once upon a time, I thought, oh, that was an achievement, wasn't it? Actually, it makes no bloody difference at all, resolutions, policies, laws, if you don't change the culture, really. The UN, when it was looking at education for all, argued, well, you know, lots of meetings like this one, or conferences that generate resolutions, international agreements, designed to hold the community to account, are set up, but by themselves they don't do any good, because when you see in 1989 we agreed to halve the level of illiteracy in the world by 2015. In 2000 we reasserted that aim. In the 11 years between the first and the second, there was quite a drop, 12% drop in the numbers of people who didn't read and write. In the next 15 years, reasserted goal, all sorts of progress towards universal primary schooling, but around literacy for adults, just 2% shift. So that the numbers in the end, because the world's population has been growing, were just about the same as they were in 1989, and the percentage of women hadn't shifted by 1% for all the rhetoric. And yet, you know this about families, if you don't teach women, their children, well, even if they learn, how do you embed it? How do you sustain it? And that's as true for our marginalised communities in the industrial north as it is for rural India. Colin mentioned the work that our organisation, when I worked at NICE, commissioned around thinking about lifelong learning policy for a country like Britain, and arguing that one useful way of thinking about it was to think about the rather different needs of different life phases beyond initial education. And they looked at roughly 18 to 25, the next 25 years, 50 to 75 and 75 plus, and you could say crudely 18 to 25. This is a picture from some Scottish research on the extraordinary. You don't need to just look at the colours. They describe whether people stay in full-time education, get jobs, shift about, and do different things. And what it shows when you look at it in microscopic detail is that young people's transitions to the adult labour market are much more varied than the old clockwork model where you stayed in education for so long and then you shot into the labour market for the rest of your life. So firstly, young people are more of a mess than we think they are. Secondly, it's bloody hard to fit in time to do any learning when you're forming relationships, having children, doing a job. And this really rather encouraging research from Oswald in 2007, which showed that when you think about well-being, how well you feel about the world, things get worse until you're 42, and then they get better every year afterwards. And I'm 67, going on 8, and it's getting better all the time. So I thought that was but there is a time squeeze during those intermediate years that does mean that, and yet that's where we put most of our attention and effort, either on the first group or on the early half of the second group. And it's jolly difficult, and therefore the kind of international research shows us that making a difference in adult learning is a hard job, and unless you invest lots of money, the changes are pretty marginal. Then the third stage, the whole of our civil society relies on people moving out of the second stage of their employment, running civil society for us, organising in all kinds of ways. Again, the stuff we saw this morning, organising practical solutions to shared problems. The 1919 report on the case for adult education after the First World War said, this is never a criticism, it's not a criticism of municipal government, however well-intentioned, that they fail to meet all the aspirations and needs of local communities. So you're always going to have voluntary bodies inventing themselves in order to remind you of what you're not doing now. And thank goodness for it. But you see, there is a difference in formal volunteering as people get a bit older. But informal volunteering, doing the shopping for your neighbour, taking in a cup of tea or a piece of cake, that's just as important too. We did some research on what people learn at different ages of their lives, and we thought the fascinating thing is, if you look at the dominant model, this is 7 years ago, so computer skills was still, actually that's been declining pretty massively since. People think they know, they don't really think that's learning anymore, by and large. But you've got work associated, if you take all adults, very dominant in the thinking about what ought to be organised. But as people get older, the liberal arts agenda reasserts itself, trying to think about what's the meaning of life, what's stimulating about life, how better to understand health and medicine and so on. And, well, I didn't, it's the fourth stage, increasing dependency. It's wonderful work about taking volunteer learners into old people's homes and transforming their lives. A YouTube piece on lifelong learning which shows that when you start exercise classes and other classes in homes, the home in Derbyshire recognised a 74% drop in the use of incontinence pads in the daytime, and a 50% drop in the use of pills. And for anybody working in the health service, looking at where we are over the next 20 or 30 years, it doesn't seem to me to be a major accident that it's a public health inspired and supported initiative that's led to this Festival of Learning, rather than at the margins. This was, we found the oldest learner in the country at 2002, who's called Fred Moore. He was studying French and art, and in New Milton in Hampshire. And we had a party in the department in England of the oldest learner in each region and of the most adventurous learner over 100 in each region. And it was wonderful. And I got in a taxi and told the taxi driver about this afterwards, and he said, "Yeah, doesn't he know yet he's not going to be Picasso?" And then there was a long pause, and he said, "Still, he's got twice my age, and more gumption than me, I better do something." So that's to say that motivation telling a good story is a way of getting people to see that it might be for the likes of them too. Those, if you go on with I won't go into the detail, but the inquiry does look at a range of issues about the kind of capabilities and capacities we need to generate in people, and bright wheezes to get people going. I was always in favour of, the way the Queen sends you a postcard or something when you're 100. I thought when you were 40, you ought to get a pocket of resources to do a bit of learning. When you're 50, you should get another one, but just a bit more, and 60 and 70, so that you recognise that the state believes that learning will be good for you. I argue that a lifelong learning for a world worth living in has to be able to respond to difference and diversity. And I mean, celebrating men's sheds isn't really difficult. I was doing something in Sheffield and talking to a former steel worker who explained to me that college, he said, that's a step up for women and a step down for men. And gender is a really important issue. I mean, that's why the men's shed stuff is, well, it's not for the likes of me. I can't see myself sitting in I want real men's work. And of course, they're not going to get it. So I pointed there towards some things that work. This is my one contribution on technology, and I love it. It's a Serbian grannies convention, sitting with a not brand new computer on Skype, talking to their great-grandchildren in Adelaide from somewhere outside Belgrade. And, not unlike 19th century Irish or British citizens whose families emigrated to the other side of the world, it's a bewildering thing to be able to see the great-grandchildren you never thought you'd live to see. So very powerful stuff, learning a little bit of technology. So creative use of technologies does matter. I think Learning Cities are a really important initiative. They are a place it's easier to combine resources to lower your defences, but you do need passion, and you do need a sponsor, and you do need to negotiate who the sponsor's successor is going to be, because we've had it in Britain 15 years ago, really creative, and then it all collapsed. Dig where you stand and listen to learners. Those my last comment is this was from an Adult Learners Week event. We asked a bunch of school kids in London what lifelong learning is, and they said it's beautiful, fun, awesome, and cool, and I recommend it to you.